So this section consists of 3 rotary controls and 2 switches. Down position on this first switch is dual mode, and this purely relates to the dual output, so it won't have any effect on the individual outputs of the filters. So in this instance I've just got 2 VCOs and some noise going into input 1, and in dual mode this input will be duplicated across both filters, so it'll be sent to VCF1, but it'll also simultaneously be sent to VCF2, and then the audio mix pot will just adjust the balance between them. So at the moment I've got a high pass filter working on the input signal on VCF1 and a low pass filtering working on the same audio source on VCF2. The dual mode will also work with 2 different inputs, so if I take a triangle, put that in input 2, now it'll blend between the 2 filters, filtering 2 separate audio signals. So what you're getting in dual mode is, irrespective of whether you're sending the same signal to both filters or separate signals to both filters individually, you're getting a mix of the output of both filters in parallel, which means separately. But in Cascade mode, the audio from VCF1, instead of being sent to the audio mix, it's sent directly to VCF2. So the incoming signal input 1 is filtered once by VCF1, then passed to VCF2 and filtered again. Then the output of VCF2 is sent to the audio mix, and so it will still be present at the dual output. It's also output at output 2, but if you use output 2 it then bypasses the audio mix, so you can't get the advantage of being able to blend the 2 sounds together. So if I take the audio mix down to just VCF1, when I switch into Cascade mode you won't notice any sound difference, because in this position it's just going to output the sound coming from VCF1 just like it does in dual mode. But as you change the audio mix, it will start to change the balance between the output of VCF1 and the output of VCF2, which in this case is actually the output of VCF2 filtering the output of VCF1. So you're getting the result of 2 filters coming out of VCF2 going into the audio mix. So that is the output of VCF2. I've got a high pass mode on this filter going into the low pass mode of this filter, and then being sent to the audio mix. And at the moment, because I've got the audio mix set to VCF2 completely, that's all you're hearing. And if I set it at 50%, I'm getting half of the original sound coming out of VCF1 in high pass mode, and then the result of VCF1 filtered by VCF2. And as I mentioned before, you can use output 2, but then you just get the sound of VCF2 filtering VCF1, so you lose the functionality of the audio mix. However, unlike dual mode, if I connect to input 2, This will cancel out the cascade effect because it's interrupted the connection between VCF1 and VCF2. So it's no longer receiving the output from VCF1. Instead, it's receiving the signal that you've got coming into input 2. So that's just the sound coming from this VCO down here. If I take that out again, that's the sound of the two filters cascaded. And with two inputs, it just mixes back to the output of VCF1 again, or a combination of the two. So you basically get the same result whether the cascade switch is up or down. When the Gemini is in dual mode, the output of VCF2 can be inverted against the output of VCF1. At the moment I've got the filter in dual mode and I've tried to set both filters as closely as possible to the same settings, given that they're analogue. And if you look at the image from the oscilloscope, in blue is the output of VCF1 and yellow the output of VCF2. And they look pretty much identical. And I'm using an LFO through dual frequency CV to pan the frequency of both just to make it a bit clearer visually on the scope. But look what happens to the image and listen what happens to the sound when I flip it into inverted. See, now the yellow image from filter 2 is pretty much a mirror image of filter 1, and also there's been a very big audio level drop. This happens because the output of both filters are now out of phase with each other. It's called phase cancellation. If I remove the LFO, you can hear it sounds even quieter. Try and add a similar amount of resonance to both sounds, just to make the effect more audible. And listen what happens when I start to create a small difference between the frequency of both filters. This is how phasers work. If I turn the invert off, all you're hearing now is just the two filters in dual mode, both following the same LFO, so they're being panned around their frequencies at the same speed. Because their base frequencies are in different positions, then they're kind of chasing each other's tail. This is particularly evident in bandpass mode because if you imagine in bandpass you're allowing just a portion, like a hump of the frequency range through the filter, and then with an LFO you're moving that range backwards and forwards. And so with two filters in unison, sharing the same output in this case, those two humps are being moved at different times, so they're crossing each other. And as they do, you get that phase cancellation effect, hence the name of phaser. This will only work in dual mode. If I change to cascade, first of all, it means because I've got the mix at 50%, I'll have 50% of the output from VCF1 because I'm using the dual out. So if I move it away to VCF2, now you're just hearing the output of VCF2 filtering VCF1. It still sounds a little bit phaser-like because you've got similar settings and they're being modulated at the same speed and the same strength through the dual frequency CV function. But if I switch the invert off, you'll hear it makes no difference. It's not actually work in cascaded mode. You can try other filter modes like low pass. It will still have the same principle still applies. Or even experiment and mixing the modes. Probably the most obvious and easy to understand of the three functions will be the audio mix. And this only relates to this dual output here. And what this determines is the mix between the output of both filters that appear at this output. So in a central position, you're getting an equal measure of both filters, and also that's dependent on input level and frequency. That will change the loudness of the signal, in which case you just move this left or right in order to get the desired balance between the two. So I've got two sounds going into the Gemini at the moment. One is pink noise, and I've got the filter in high pass mode with quite a lot of resonance, and I've also connected the 1V proctave from the keyboard via the glide noise to the 1V proctave input of that particular filter so that it tracks the keyboard. Then on the other side I've got a square wave from a VCO with some pulse width modulation, and this is in low pass mode with no resonance. So with the audio mix I can just mix between the two sounds. But I can automate this process because you've got the mix CV input, and this expects a signal between 0 to 5 volts positive. Anything that's below 0 volts, it will just be ignored. In the case of an envelope generator, they generally output a signal in the range of 0 to 10 volts positive. But if I connect the output of this envelope to the mix CV, and once the signal is present at the mix CV input, the audio mix pot then becomes an attenuator. So it will determine how much modulation signal, in this case the envelope, will modulate the balance between the two filters. So essentially 0 volts coming into the mix CV would give you just VCF1, whereas 5 volts and above will give you just VCF2. And then any sort of variation between those two CV voltages will give you a mix of the two. So if I turn the pot all the way up, bearing in mind that this will ignore anything over 5 volts, it will still start from 0. As soon as it receives the envelope, that 10 volts should, because I've got this attack speed on the envelope down to its fastest rate, it should automatically start with VCF2 and then fade into VCF1. We change the envelope settings as well. Short decay means it'll only stay on VCF2 for a little while before the decay will send it into VCF1. If I have sustain all the way up, then as long as I've got the key held down, it will stay on VCF2. Then it will fade to VCF1 when I take my finger off the key. And then about halfway, if I keep the key held down, it should give me a bit of both. And it'll stay like that until I release the key, then it'll just go to VCF1. And because the envelope generator is producing a range of 0 to 10 volts, and this is expecting 0 to 5, then it might be useful to back off the attenuator for the audio mix. And I'll explain that by having a sustain on full, so that when I've got the key pressed down, it will just stay on the sound from VCF2. First of all, if I let go of that, you'll hear there's a delay before it moves over into VCF1. That's because the voltage is lowering from 10 volts gradually down past 5 and then eventually to 0. But if I reduce the level of CV from the attenuator, keep going until I can just hear VCF1 and 2, right there. Go a bit beyond it so I can only hear VCF2 again. Just leave it there. Now I've got the key held down, I can just hear VCF2, and as soon as I release it, it just goes straight into VCF1. It's kind of like trimming off the excess voltage that you don't need, so that you get that instant movement from one filter to the other. If you've got a DH ADSR, then you could use the inverted output, in which case the behaviour of the filter will be the opposite way round. It will start off, with the same sort of envelope as over here. You'll start hearing just VCF1 and it will fade into VCF2. You might also want to use an LFO to modulate the audio mix. Let's say if you've got a drone sound and you want it to gradually pan between the output of both filters. But then the output of an LFO is between -5 to +5 volts, and obviously this input is expecting 0 to +5 volts. That means that all the time as the LFO is going through its cycle, as it goes down below 0, that CV won't affect the filter at all. It'll only be affecting it once it climbs back up above 0, reaches to 5, and then down again. So what that means is that most of the time, if I patch CV into just a triangle LFO, most of the time you're just hearing VCF1. Because 0 volts is just going to select VCF1 and 5 volts will select VCF2. So what this means is an offset needs to be applied to the output of the LFO to shift that range, and then it needs to be adjusted a little bit, and that's where the CV mix comes in handy. So if I go to take the output from the CV mix to the Gemini, and then connect the output of the LFO, in this case to input 2. At the moment you'll hear nothing because everything's at 0. So this is the attenuator for channel 2. If I add this, it will just start adding that signal again from the LFO. So same as before, most of the time you're just hearing VCF1. But if nothing is connected to input 1, then channel 1 on the CV mix becomes a fixed voltage, which is either added or subtracted from the output of the module. So if I add a voltage, I better push that voltage range upwards into something more useful. So now you're hearing more of VCF2, but it's still loitering too long in either side of the filter. That's because the output of the LFO is covering 10 volts, whereas it's only expecting a range of 5. But because you've got an attenuator here, you can limit the amount of signal that's coming in from the LFO and then being mixed with the fixed voltage. So if I reduce that to somewhere near half, and let's say just very approximately, that's cutting it down from a 10 volt output range to an output range of about 5 volts. Now it means that it's not loitering in either filter too long before it just starts panning over to the other one. And this often need a bit of fine tuning, but it just gives you a huge range of basically being able to pinpoint exactly where you want the modulation to occur and how much of it. So you could even shift it so you've got more of one sound than the other if you wanted to. But also, if you've got the tap tempo LFO, then that has the advantage of having a bipolar output, which is just same as a regular LFO output. It outputs a range of between -5 and +5 volts, but also a unipolar output, which outputs just like an envelope. It outputs a range of 0 to +10 volts. So that means that it won't go below 0 volts, so you won't get near that unusable voltage range. This has its own VCA and level control, so you might just automatically put the level up all the way. What that means is you're getting a full 0 to 10 volt range from this module, but then that's not really what you want, because the range coming in is the range that the module is expecting is 0 to 5 volts. So if you reduce the attenuator to approximately half, then you're reducing the amount of voltage that's coming out of the tap tempo LFO. So just something approximating 5 volts, so that then you're getting just the kind of range of signal that you want to sweep the filter sufficiently between one side and the other, so that it's not loitering on either side for too long. And of course you could use any CV signal to control the audio mix, even something like a sequencer or a keyboard. The dual frequency CV function allows you to control the frequency of both filters simultaneously. However, both filters will still function independently, so it will just complement whatever you want to do with the filters independently. But unlike the audio mix, it doesn't just affect the audio output, it also affects the results coming out of the individual outputs for both filters, because you're ultimately controlling or affecting the frequency of both or either. So if I reduce the frequency CV level pot, you can hear it reduces the frequency of both filters. I can also control this by CV. So let's say I wanted to use an envelope to control this. Now, the input for this has actually got a -10 volt to +10 volt CV range, so it's got a large amount of headroom. And when a CV is connected to the input, this pot then becomes an attenuator for the amount of CV that it's allowing to affect the frequency of the two filters. So if I reduce it to nothing, then there's no influence coming from the envelope. I can still control the individual frequency of the two filters. Now the dual frequency CV mix adjusts the balance of that incoming CV that's going to either filter. So if I turn it all the way to VCF2, so now that's sent all of the incoming CV to VCF2, and as a result the influence of the envelope over VCF2 is greater, so it's raised the maximum frequency that it's reaching on the filter. So if I reduce that a little bit, and you can't hear VCF1 at all because I've got quite a low frequency setting on it. So if I raise that, and the envelope's not affecting that at all. The only thing that's affecting that is just this 1-volt prop tape coming from the keyboard. So let's disconnect that. I'm going to turn the pot all the way to VCF1. It's greatly increased the amount of envelope influence over the first filter. I'm going to raise the frequency of VCF2 so you can hear that it's not getting any influence from the envelope. So aside from providing a convenient way of controlling the frequency of both filters simultaneously, FCV level also adds CV to the frequency range of both filters. So let's say I'll reduce, stop for VCF2 and take frequency right down to 0 so you can still hear it. Well, I can reduce that further by reducing the dual frequency CV level. So now all I can hear is the VCA. And likewise, I can raise the frequency of the filter. It doesn't prevent you from reaching the maximum frequency on the filter. It just gives you a bit more scope. So the fact that both filters can still be controlled independently in exactly the same way, but also simultaneously affected by the mix bus in the center of the module. This gives a huge amount of flexibility, because not only does this affect how you can use the filter in dual mode, for example, coming out of the dual output, but even as two separate filters, because these could be handling two completely different melody lines in a sequence or in a composition, for example. So they could have their own envelopes and their own LFOs and whatnot, and they're completely their own settings, processing two different sounds. But they could still have some global effect, some degree of control added to that from, let's say, a sequencer or something. So this adds an absolutely huge amount of flexibility to not just using the Gemini as one filter, but even using it as two completely separate filters.